I found the letter duct-taped to my fence, handwritten in red ink like a ransom note. It wasn't from the post office. It wasn't even from a neighbor. It was from the HOA of Willow Creek Estates, a gated community a half-mile down the road. The note read, "As of April 1st, the rear acreage of your lot is considered HOA communal green space. Please remove all personal property within 48 hours or fines will be assessed." My jaw dropped. They weren't asking. They were informing me like they already owned it. Thing is, my land isn't part of their HOA. Never was. And they had just declared war on the wrong guy. My name's Marcus, and I live on an old 10-acre spread passed down from my grandfather. It's got a weathered red barn, a wraparound porch, and a field of switchgrass that rolls out behind the house like a golden sea. Peaceful. Private. It's the kind of land that breathes with history, not HOA bylaws. I'm not one to stir trouble. I work from home, keep to myself, and mind my land. But when people show up claiming part of my property is theirs, yeah, that gets personal fast. 2 days after the letter, a white SUV rolls up my gravel drive. It's one of those high-end ones, spotless despite the dust, with tinted windows and chrome wheels that say, "I've never towed a thing in my life." Out steps Patricia, mid-50s, immaculately dressed like she's hosting a garden party, clipboard in hand and a smugness that could stain steel. Alongside her is a balding man in a cheap suit, her HOA's legal counsel, apparently, and a guy with a measuring wheel and a neon vest who's already halfway across my property line like he owns it. I come off the porch slowly, coffee in hand, trying not to laugh. She doesn't even say hello. "Good morning. We're just confirming boundaries," she chirps, pointing to the field behind my barn. "There's been a survey correction. That rear parcel back there? It was never meant to be private. It's technically within our HOA's common space. We'll be installing a fence next week." I blinked. Not even a pause for permission. Just boom, "Your land is ours." I asked what survey she was referencing, and Patricia whipped out a color-coded map with the confidence of someone who's never been told no in her life. The thing looked like it was printed from a free map app and highlighted with kindergarten markers. I told her that my property line was registered with the county. She said their developer found an error and they were correcting it before it became a nuisance. A nuisance? This woman was treating my field like a misplaced lawn chair. I told them flat out, "That's my land. That surveyor has no right to be on it." Patricia waved it off and said I should take it up with the HOA board if I had concerns. Then she turned around, snapped her fingers at the neon vest guy, and said, "Start measuring along the fence line." Just like that. On my property. Without permission. Without shame. I didn't yell. I didn't get angry. I just walked back into my house and grabbed something from my safe, a thick, embossed leather folder my grandfather gave me before he passed. Inside was the original deed from 1947, handwritten, stamped, with coordinates that matched the metal stakes still buried in the four corners of our land. I scanned it, emailed it to my attorney, and then started my own quiet file. Photos, drone shots, video of their surveyor pacing my field. Patricia smiling at the property line like she was posing for a real estate ad. 3 days later, they came back with a construction crew. I'm not kidding. They rolled in with fence panels, concrete posts, and a guy on a mini backhoe. They posted signs that said, "Private HOA property. No trespassing," right next to my old well. That's when I realized Patricia wasn't just power-hungry. She was reckless. She didn't understand boundaries. Not legal ones. Not physical ones. Certainly not moral ones. I called the sheriff's office. The deputy who showed up looked younger than my boot. He scratched his head and said it sounded like a civil issue, since no one was being violent. I pointed to my property stakes. He shrugged and said the courts would have to decide. I thanked him and walked him back to his cruiser, all smiles. What Patricia didn't know, what no one in the HOA knew, was that I'd been quietly leasing exploration rights on my rear acreage to a small mining operation. Nothing major, just exploratory. But last year, they'd found traces of rare minerals, valuable enough to interest a few bigger players. I hadn't said a word. I was waiting for the right moment to go public. And now? They'd just built an unauthorized fence over what might be the most profitable 5 acres in the entire county. That night, I sat on my porch, watching the sun sink behind the fence they'd built. I didn't see a barrier. I saw an opportunity. They wanted my land. They claimed it without asking. They built on it without rights, which meant every action they took, every post they drove into my soil, was another nail in their legal coffin. I took one last sip of coffee and smiled to myself. The sign they'd posted said, "No trespassing." I was about to make sure that they and their precious little HOA would never trespass into anyone's life again. Because when you try to steal from someone who knows the law better than you don't just lose the fight, you pay the price. And trust me, the bill was about to hit 7 figures. The fence didn't just sit there quietly, it multiplied. By the end of the week, the HOA had fenced off nearly 2 acres of my land, and they weren't subtle about it. Workers stomped across my grass like it was their birthright, hoisting up cheap metal signs that read "Future HOA Park" and planting decorative bushes along the newly claimed perimeter. They installed a park bench on my property. It faced the sunset, right where my grandfather used to sit and sip whiskey after a long day. And there it was now, some smug HOA attempt at gentrified landscaping, complete with little solar lights that blinked like mocking eyes in the dark. It wasn't enough to steal the land, they were making it look like it had never belonged to anyone else. I didn't stop them. Not yet. Every drill hole, every footprint, every misplaced landscaping feature was more fuel for what I was building. Evidence. I had a time-stamped digital photo of every single change they made, every person who stepped onto my property, every vehicle that entered and parked without permission. I didn't argue with the fence crew. I didn't challenge Patricia when she came by, clapping her hands and pretending she was leading a guided tour of Versailles. I just watched, documented, and smiled politely like I didn't have a nuclear legal warhead waiting to launch. Meanwhile, Patricia grew bolder. She started handing out flyers around the neighborhood, declaring the backfield a newly added shared green space, and crediting herself for resolving the parcel issue with grace. Grace. That woman used the word grace to describe what was essentially a slow-motion land grab. She invited families for yoga mornings and Saturday picnics, and before I knew it, strangers were lounging on my property with folding chairs and mini coolers, their dogs running loose near my barn like it was a community park. It was ridiculous. One guy actually asked me where the public restrooms were. Another woman yelled at me for not mowing the HOA's field to their usual landscaping standards. One teenager filmed a TikTok on my tractor. It would have been hilarious if it hadn't been so infuriating. I kept my cool because every visitor, every selfie, every complaint was another slice of proof. I even installed a small motion-detecting camera near the barn, which captured Patricia leading an HOA meeting under the willow tree my grandfather planted in the 60s. She even used my old tractor wheel as a podium stand. That's when I called Jim. Jim's a land use attorney I've known since college. He once got a billboard company to pay $400,000 for putting 1 foot of concrete on the wrong side of a property line. If anyone could turn this HOA invasion into a financial reckoning, it was him. I sent him everything: deed scans, drone shots, photos, videos, witness statements from a few old locals who'd known my property for decades. Jim went silent for a day, then called me back with 3 words: "You've got them." He explained what I already suspected. Because the HOA had physically occupied the land and improved it with fixed installations like benches, signs, and landscaping, it now counted as occupied use. And since they weren't owners, tenants, licensees, or guests, that made it trespassing. Civil trespassing was bad enough, but because they were an incorporated entity and had used their power to claim and utilize private property? That elevated it into a much nastier category. They were open to punitive damages. Even better, the mineral rights I'd held gave me a unique advantage. See, when my grandfather passed, he didn't just leave me the land. He left me the mineral rights to the soil underneath it. Most people sell or separate those out over the years, but not Grandpa. He was old school. And last year, I had quietly begun negotiations with a small exploration company interested in the rare earth materials beneath the land. Nothing had been finalized yet, but it was enough to qualify the area as a potential mineral development zone. Patricia and her gang had no idea that by fencing off and developing my property, they were also interfering with a prospective commercial operation. That's called tortious interference. And it's expensive. Jim drafted a preliminary demand letter, while I contacted the exploration company and gave them the green light to begin formal surveying. Within 10 days, their trucks rolled up the drive, big, heavy, loud machines with logos on the side and serious-looking guys in reflective vests. Patricia nearly swallowed her clipboard when she saw them. She stormed over in full passive-aggressive rage, demanding to know who gave them permission to drill on community land. One of the survey guys pointed at me and said, "The landowner." I waved. She turned bright red and began shouting something about permits and violations, but I was already on the phone with the county inspector. That call was strategic. The county had no record of the land being transferred to the HOA because, legally, it never had been. The inspector came out, took one look at my grandfather's deed, and nodded. No annexation paperwork. No title change. The land was still mine, and had always been mine. When he saw the HOA's signage, he frowned and said, "This is gonna be fun." The next day, Jim filed a formal cease and desist order with the HOA, demanding immediate removal of all property and structures from my land. But that was just the appetizer. He also filed a lawsuit for unauthorized land use, trespass, interference with commercial activity, and defamation based on the flyers Patricia distributed. We weren't just demanding that they remove their fence. We were coming for damages. That's when Patricia panicked. She called a special emergency HOA meeting, which they held, ironically, under my willow tree again. I watched from the porch as her voice cracked, and she flailed through legal jargon she didn't understand. A few of the HOA board members looked uncomfortable. One guy stood up and asked, "Wait, this land's not actually ours?" Patricia barked that it was a misunderstanding and that Marcus wouldn't really sue us. I smiled wider. I already had. Later that night, I received an email from Patricia. It was short, desperate, and fake-friendly. She offered to negotiate terms and proposed that the HOA lease the backfield from me to avoid community disruption. I didn't reply. I sent the email to Jim, who laughed so hard he nearly dropped his drink. Then he added it to the folder marked Evidence of Guilt. By week's end, the HOA tried filing for a restraining order against the drilling equipment, claiming disruption of tranquility. Jim filed an immediate countersuit and requested an emergency hearing. The judge approved it. Court was now officially on the calendar. They had no idea just how deep the hole they dug for themselves really was. I was done playing nice. And they were about to find out that stealing land from someone who actually knows how the law works doesn't end with a fence. It ends with a bill. A big one. The courthouse smelled like old paper and ego. I sat near the front, calm and steady, while Patricia paced in the hallway like a cat that had finally realized the laser pointer was attached to a bear trap. Her usual smugness was gone, replaced with frantic whispers between her and the HOA's legal representative, a younger attorney named Dylan who looked like he had just graduated from Fake It Till You Make It law school. He kept shuffling papers, none of which were actual deeds or legitimate ownership documents. I leaned back in my chair, arms folded, watching as their whole world unraveled under fluorescent lights and legal deadlines. When the judge called us in, the air in the courtroom tightened. Patricia tried to flash the judge a warm smile. He didn't even look up from his bench. We were here for an emergency hearing, and the judge had already read our complaint, the photos, drone footage, mineral rights documents, and the HOA's newsletter declaring the land as newly acquired public space. His opening statement was blunt. He said, "I've read the filings. If the HOA cannot produce a legitimate title change, this court is prepared to move forward with damages." Patricia's lawyer gulped. I could hear it from across the room. Their argument started as a confused mess of development maps, HOA boundary claims, and a shaky reference to a survey commissioned by their property management company. But every time they spoke, Jim, my attorney, countered with hard facts. He held up the original deed, certified by the county. He showed GPS coordinates from the official surveyor that matched the steel posts embedded on my property. Then came the drone videos. Footage of HOA crews walking onto my land, installing fencing, hosting events, planting landscaping, all time-stamped, all without permission. Patricia tried to interrupt. "Your Honor, we acted in good faith. The community," but the judge raised a hand like a stop sign. He didn't care about the community yoga classes or picnic. He cared about trespass and property rights. Jim leaned in at that moment and delivered the punch. He introduced the mineral rights claim and the contract I had been negotiating with the exploration company. The judge looked intrigued and asked for clarification. Jim explained how the HOA's unauthorized construction had delayed exploratory drilling and directly interfered with a commercial transaction. Now the courtroom had shifted from a land dispute to a financial damage case. Patricia blinked like she had just walked into the wrong courtroom entirely. Her lawyer tried to pivot, claiming they didn't know about the mineral rights and that it was unfair to expect a homeowners association to understand subsurface property law. The judge asked simply, "Did you build on land you did not own?" Dylan hesitated. Technically, the judge cut him off. "That's a yes." Then came the moment I had waited for. The damages statement. Jim didn't hold back. He outlined the cost of interference. Delayed drilling, loss of prospective income, stress from public defamation via HOA newsletters, illegal signage implying community ownership, and unauthorized use of land for public gatherings. He presented invoices, statements from the exploration company, and expert evaluations. The number wasn't small. We were asking for $1.2 million in damages, plus attorney fees and immediate removal of all structures built on my property. Patricia looked like she had been hit with a sandbag. She leaned into Dylan, whispering furiously. He stood up and asked for a continuance. Denied. Then he asked for time to negotiate settlement terms. The judge nodded once and recessed for 15 minutes to give them a chance to make a formal offer. We didn't move. We sat still. Patricia marched out of the courtroom and nearly ran into the hallway wall. When they came back, their tone had changed. Dylan stood up and offered a settlement amount that barely covered half the damages. Jim smiled politely and declined. The judge asked if we were willing to consider counteroffers. Jim said we'd only consider full restitution and removal of all unauthorized installations within 72 hours. Patricia looked like she was chewing gravel. She turned toward me and said, "You don't understand how this looks to our community. You're ruining everything we've built." I calmly replied, "No. You ruined everything when you built it on someone else's land." The judge ruled before the day was over. He confirmed the land legally belonged to me, that the HOA had knowingly acted without proper documentation, and that the interference with mineral operations justified the full extent of our damages claim. He ordered immediate payment from the HOA's reserves and allowed us to recover attorney fees and court costs. Patricia tried to object again, mumbling something about board appeals. The judge told her the only thing she should be appealing is her understanding of basic property law. By the end of the day, the court had issued a formal injunction against the HOA using or accessing my land. They were to dismantle all signs, remove all fencing, and issue a retraction letter to their residents clarifying that the park space was never legally part of their community. Jim handed me a signed copy of the ruling and said, "They're going to need a bigger bake sale." The news traveled faster than gossip in a bingo hall. By the time I got home, my inbox was flooded with interview requests. Local news stations wanted to cover the story. I declined most of them, but I did grant one request, from a journalist who had also battled her HOA years ago. Her article went viral, titled "Man Turns HOA Overreach into $1.2 Million Legal Victory." It was reposted on Reddit under r/EntitledPeople, where the comments exploded with cheering, advice, and 100 jokes about HOA yoga mats being used as legal tender. But the best moment came the following morning. I stepped outside with my coffee and saw a maintenance crew from the HOA awkwardly removing the metal signs and hauling off the fake stone bench Patricia had posed in front of just a week earlier. They didn't make eye contact. One guy even nodded at me and said, "Sorry, man. We just work here." I nodded back. I had no grudge against the workers, just the clipboard tyrants who sent them. That night, the board sent out an email blast to their residents explaining the loss. It was filled with carefully chosen words like boundary misunderstanding and temporary encroachment. But the homeowners weren't buying it. Several of them reached out to me directly to apologize. A few even said they were considering recalling the HOA board entirely. I didn't blame them. Patricia had dragged their whole community into a lawsuit over a field that was never hers to begin with. I stood at the edge of the field that evening, right by the willow tree, watching the sun dip low over the horizon. The ground was mine again, legally, officially, permanently. But it had never stopped being mine. Not for a second. And now, thanks to their arrogance, it wasn't just a patch of grass behind a barn. It was the most expensive mistake the HOA would ever make. The news didn't just fade, it ignited. Within 48 hours of the court ruling, the story had spread beyond our county lines. A local blogger picked it up and added flair, dubbing me the man who made the HOA pay. That headline alone was enough to catch the attention of local TV stations and real estate forums, and then Reddit exploded. I watched in stunned amusement as complete strangers celebrated my victory like it was a championship game. They weren't wrong, it felt like one. Except instead of trophies, I had court-certified checks, and instead of fans, I had a growing army of HOA haters cheering me on from across the internet. Back home, the fallout was even louder. Patricia officially resigned from the HOA board 3 days after the judgment. Her resignation letter, which someone leaked to me, was an unhinged 2-page rant blaming miscommunication, disloyal board members, and even hostile landowner tactics. She never once admitted fault. Not a word about fencing off private land, forging ahead with false claims, or dragging her entire community into legal and financial disaster. Classic Patricia, clinging to power even as the ship was halfway underwater. The HOA, now under interim leadership, held a meeting in the clubhouse to figure out how to pay the damages. I wasn't invited, of course, but I didn't need to be. The sounds of that meeting carried loud and clear across the road. Voices were raised. One man demanded to know how the board had failed to verify property lines before starting construction. Another woman asked if the HOA could sue Patricia personally. A teenager recording everything for TikTok got kicked out, but not before uploading a minute-long clip of someone yelling, "We have to pay how much?" The board had no choice but to liquidate asset. First, they held a massive garage sale at the clubhouse. They sold pool furniture, gym equipment, yoga mats, even decorative lamps and flower pots. Residents were furious. Some had paid dues for years, and were now watching the amenities vanish. A few approached me afterward, not with anger, but with a strange mix of regret and sympathy. They'd never agreed with Patricia's tactics, they said. They just didn't think it would escalate like this. I nodded politely. I wasn't interested in revenge at this point. I already had that, complete, court-sanctioned, and fully paid. But that didn't mean I was done. The final fence post came down a week later, and I stood on my porch watching it like the ending of a bad movie. No one from the HOA looked me in the eye during the teardown. I wasn't angry. I wasn't smug. I was thinking about what came next. The exploration company had quietly resumed drilling on the mineral-rich portion of my land. Their initial core samples had come back positive. Very positive. One of the engineers pulled me aside and said, "You might be sitting on something bigger than we expected." He didn't elaborate, but I didn't need specifics. All I needed was their continued interest. And they were more interested than ever. With that in motion, I decided to make a statement. Not petty. Not angry. Just clear. I went to a local woodworker and commissioned a thick, rugged sign made from reclaimed oak. It was carved, not painted, with bold letters that read, "Private property, trespassers will be billed." I didn't add anything about the court case or the payout. I didn't need to. Everyone around here already knew. The sign was staked into the exact center of the space where the HOA used to host their yoga sessions. A couple of nosy walkers paused to take photos. I smiled and waved. Let the legend grow. Then something unexpected happened. A new board member from the HOA, an older man named Ronald, requested a sit-down. He asked to come over and talk about future peacekeeping. I agreed, mostly out of curiosity. We met on my porch, and he was respectful, even a little embarrassed. He apologized for the mess Patricia caused, explained how the HOA was restructuring, and, with visible discomfort, asked if I would consider leasing the land to them on weekends, now that they knew the boundaries. I let the silence hang between us for a good 10 seconds before answering. "No," I said. "But I'll offer you something else." I proposed a $1 a year lease. Symbolic. Legally airtight. On the condition that they place a permanent plaque outside their clubhouse. The plaque would read, "This community attempted to seize private land. We now pay rent." Ronald looked like he'd swallowed a lemon. He didn't answer right away. I didn't expect him to. He left, saying he'd take it to the board. I never heard back. Instead, 2 weeks later, I received an envelope with a check for $1 and a copy of the proposed plaque design. Bronze. Clean font. Installed right next to the main clubhouse entrance. I framed the check and put it on the wall in my home office. But that wasn't the final twist. Patricia wasn't done embarrassing herself. A month after the case closed, she filed a personal lawsuit against me for intentional humiliation and targeted public shaming. She claimed the HOA's reputation had been destroyed, and she wanted compensation. It would have been laughable if it weren't so predictably bitter. Jim responded with one letter, a demand for dismissal and a reminder that truth is a legal defense to defamation. The court tossed her suit in under 10 minutes. But during the process, Jim uncovered something bigger. While reviewing Patricia's filing, he found inconsistencies in her address record. Turns out, she didn't actually live full-time in the HOA. Her primary residence was 2 counties over. That meant she may not have even qualified to serve on the board in the first place. Jim passed the information to the State Housing Authority. They launched a quiet investigation, and within weeks, new violations surfaced. Financial misreporting, unapproved expenses, improper elections. The state ordered the HOA to suspend operations pending full compliance review. Ronald resigned. Several residents began openly discussing disbanding the HOA entirely. Meanwhile, I stood at the edge of my field with a clipboard of my own, going over the latest site plans from the exploration company. They wanted to build a small processing facility. Not huge. Just enough to manage extraction locally. They offered me a cut of every ounce they pulled from the ground. I said yes. So now, every morning, trucks roll past the former HOA gate. Not obnoxious. Not loud. But steady. And legal. They're hauling the minerals the HOA tried to claim. They pass the clubhouse. They pass the plaque. And sometimes I like to stand there, cup of coffee in hand, just to watch. Not out of spite. Out of satisfaction. Because in the end, The HOA tried to take what wasn't theirs, and now they owe me more than money. They owe me a reminder that you don't mess with what you don't understand, especially when the person on the other end has a deed, a lawyer, and the patience to let you dig your own grave, one fence post at a time. It's strange how quickly everything can change, how the very ground people fought over so bitterly can return to silence once the noise fades. My land looked just like it had before the fences, the signs, the disputes, and the yelling. The grass had grown back over the trench line where their posts once stood, and the old willow tree still cast long shadows at dusk, just as it had since I was a kid. But nothing was the same. What had once been a quiet patch of inherited land had become a symbol of resistance, of principle, and of what happens when entitlement is met with unshakable resolve. People still slowed their cars when passing the wooden sign at the edge of the field. A few even pulled over to take pictures. That $1 lease check still hung on my wall like a war medal, but the real victory wasn't in the money or the fame. It was in what they didn't take. The processing facility went up quicker than anyone expected. It wasn't some towering industrial monolith. It was sleek, quiet, and barely visible beyond the treeline. The trucks came and went, and the men running the site were polite, professional, and more than a little amused when I told them the land used to be a yoga park. They installed a simple security gate along the main path, and out of respect, I asked that they keep the noise minimal near the property line. They agreed. In fact, they seemed to like the story more than the minerals. One of the engineers even asked if he could print out the Reddit thread and frame it for their break room. I told him to go ahead, just spell my name right. The HOA, on the other hand, didn't survive the season. After the state audit concluded, the community voted to dissolve the board entirely. They weren't willing to replace it. No one wanted the job, and no one trusted the structure anymore. The damage Patricia caused was too deep. Lawsuits, bad press, mismanagement of funds. It had all piled up until the idea of self-governance felt more like a threat than a privilege. Without the board, the HOA's assets were liquidated to pay the remaining legal obligations. What was left went into an escrow account, and the clubhouse stood empty, its locks changed and lights off. The bronze plaque, though, remained. No one dared touch it. Patricia disappeared for a while. Rumor had it she moved back to her primary home out of state, where she reportedly tried to join another HOA board. That one did a background check. She didn't get in. A few neighbors who had once championed her leadership now whispered about her in embarrassment. One of them, a woman named Carol, stopped me at the farmer's market and said, "We had no idea she was capable of all that." I smiled and replied, "She didn't do it alone. You all let her." Carol didn't have much to say after that. I kept my focus on the land. With the income from the mineral operation and the court payout, I invested in restoring the barn and planting new trees. I repaired the fence along the true property line, not out of necessity but out of pride. I even reinstalled the old swing that used to hang from the willow tree. It creaked the same way it always had. Some weekends, I'd sit out there with a book and a drink and watch the sun go down over the field. It felt like a place reclaimed, not just in paperwork, but in peace. The viral attention came and went. There were podcasts, a few YouTube channels that animated the story, and even one dramatized voiceover that made me sound like some kind of frontier outlaw. I found it hilarious. But when a small publishing company reached out asking if I wanted to write a book about the whole ordeal, I paused. I didn't consider myself a writer, but I had to admit the story had legs. I agreed, on one condition, that it wouldn't just be about the HOA. It had to be about land, legacy, and what it means to stand your ground when no one else believes you can. They agreed, and the manuscript became something more than I ever expected. Writing it was cathartic. It let me step back, look at every twist, every petty insult, every legal win, and see it not as a war, but as a test I'd passed with patience and principle. Sometimes I still get letters. People from all over the country send me their own HOA horror stories. Some just want a vent. Others ask for advice. A few have even driven out here hoping to shake my hand. I don't always respond, but I read every single one. There's something universal about being pushed around by people who think a clipboard and a title make them kings. There's something satisfying in showing them that rules, real rules, matter, and that those who know the law are often the last ones you want to pick a fight with. One morning, a school bus full of local kids passed by during a field trip. The teacher pointed out the property and told them, "That's where the man lives who took on the HOA and won." I stood near the sign with my coffee in hand, waved, and heard a dozen tiny voices shout, "Cool." I couldn't help but grin. It was a ridiculous legacy, sure, but one I could live with. There were no more meetings, no more violation notices, no more threats of fines or forced landscaping. My grass grew how I liked it. My barn stayed red, not neutral tan. And my property lines didn't change based on someone else's whims. The field stood as it always had, quiet, golden, and deeply mine. And every now and then I'd walk out to the very center, where the fake HOA Park sign once stood, and I'd place my boots on the same soil my grandfather once did. I'd close my eyes and remember what it felt like to almost lose it, and how sweet it felt to win it back. Because the truth is, they never stood a chance. They just didn't know it yet.